Much for joining us tonight at this 6th anniversary event of the Center for International Relations in Sustainable Development for the past 6 years. With your support and with your help, we've been trying to bring the discussion about the world affairs to Belgrade, to bring fascinating speakers, scholars, practitioners of foreign policy, diplomats. We pride on having become one of the primary shops in this part of the world of international affairs. And so far, we have had the privilege of hosting the likes of Joseph Nye and Jeffrey Sachs, Richard Haas, Nouriel Roubini, Neil Ferguson, Kevin Rudd, Ian Bremmer, amongst many others. We published a series of books, most of them on the topic of foreign affairs. And this is actually the 10th title that we are publishing in Serbian. And the book that we are launching and promoting this evening is called The Great Delusion, Liberal Dreams and International Realities. It is a book by Professor John Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, who graduated from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, having served in the American Armed Forces for about a decade before going on to pursue a brilliant academic career at a number of top-notch American academic institutions. He is currently a professor of political science at the University of Chicago. He's an author of several books, numerous articles, and most of internationally renowned outlets. I'm not going to go through a long list of books that Professor Mearsheimer wrote, but the one book that does deserve mentioning, I'm not talking about the book from this evening, but the one book that does deserve special mentioning is the 2001 Tragedy of the Great Power Politics, in which Professor Mearsheimer describes his theory of offensive realism. It was called, and it is considered by many, one of the three biggest books of the post-Cold War era, together with Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization and Francis Fukuyama's The End of History. Obviously, all these authors have a very different worldview and explanation of what has been going on in the world since the end of the Cold War. The New York Times has called Professor Mearsheimer the most influential realist in the world today. And this is, believe it or not, his very first visit to our country. This is the first time that Professor Mearsheimer is visiting Belgrade, and therefore it gives me a great pleasure to host him tonight on his first public event in Belgrade. And I ask you to join me in wishing a warm welcome to Professor John Mearsheimer.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Vuk, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It is my first time in Belgrade, and I'm really thrilled to be here. It's a beautiful city, and I've only been here a short time, but I've enjoyed myself thoroughly, and I look forward very much to tonight. And I want to thank everybody for coming out to hear me speak this evening. I'm always humbled when so many people come out to hear what I have to say. So thank you very much. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Vuk, and he can fire away at me. And I'll do my best to answer his questions, and then after that, answer your questions.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Mearsheimer. And this is it's one of the topics, one of the issues that you discuss in your book. But allow me to ask a pre-question. You know, in this country, the political division that is rather, I would say, deep these days is the one between what certain people call liberals and other people that are considered nationalists. So I know that you consider yourself a liberal nationalist in certain ways. So can there be a liberal nationalist? Is liberal and nationalist, I mean, are they mutually exclusive, or can you be one?
I believe that there are some tensions, some fundamental tensions between liberalism on one hand and nationalism on the other. And the main tension between those two isms is that liberalism focuses on the individual. Individualism is what liberalism is all about. Nationalism is all about groups. It's all about tribes. It's all about nations. It's the notion that I am born into a tribe called Americans, or a nation called Americans. You're born into a tribe or a nation called Serbians, right? So that tension between the individualism, which is at the heart of liberalism, and that groupism, the notion that you're a social animal, which is at the heart of liberalism, is in tension. So there's no question about that. But nevertheless, I do believe you can be a liberal national. Now, the problem with saying that I believe in nationalism, right, and I'm a liberal national, is that nationalism is a dirty word in many places around the world, especially the United States of America. Nationalism is considered evil, right? The problem today in the world is that nationalism is rising up and causing all sorts of problems. Nationalism is bad. Well, there's no question that nationalism can be sometimes bad and lead to trouble. But the fact of the matter is, we live in a world where the most powerful political ideology on the planet is nationalism. And we are all nationals. We are all born into tribes. We are Americans, we are Serbs, we are French, we are Germans, we are Japanese, we are Indonesia. We're born into tribes. We're all nationals. And then the question is, can you be a liberal national? Well, as you all know, the United States is a fundamentally liberal country. It has been from the get-go. What that means is that all of those liberals in the United States are liberal nationals. It can't be any other way. You're not a national if you're an American. If you're an American, you're a nationalistic. That's what nationalism is all about. Right? We live in a world of nation states. And the best example I can give you to highlight this is Madeleine Albright, who I know is not a very popular figure here in Serbia for understandable reasons. But Madeleine Albright, in the context of the United States, is considered to be a card-carrying liberal. And she was one of the principal proponents of liberal hegemony, the foreign policy that the United States pursued since 1989, which I write about in the book. But one of Madeleine Albright's most famous statements was in the late 90s. She was asked, why is the United States intervening militarily all over the world? And this famous liberal said, it is because we are the indispensable nation. We stand taller, we see further. That's what Albright said. Now just think about the words. We are the indispensable nation. We are the indispensable nation. Nation is at the heart of nationalism. We stand taller and we see further. That's the chauvinism that comes with nationalism. Virtually every nation has that sense that they're special, that they're superior. The Americans certainly have that. We call it exceptionalism. You've surely heard of American exceptionalism. That's nationalism at its core. So here you have Madeleine Albright, who is a card-carrying liberal, demonstrating very clearly by her words that she's also a nationalist. And the point I would make is I am an American nationalist, and I am a liberal nationalist. All of you are nationalists. I assume that some of you are liberal nationalists and some of you are not. But you can easily be Serbian and be a liberal nationalist, just like you could easily be American and American liberal nationalist.
Well, thank you very much for this very colorful and detailed explanation. I thought about asking you, what do you think, how important a nation state is going to be in the future? But I think you...
Yeah, I want to be very clear. Nationalism is the most powerful political ideology
and it's
on
going
the
to
planet.
stay with us in the 21st century.
Principal cause of the Balkan Wars in the 1990s was nationalism. Principal cause of the breakup of Czechoslovakia was nationalism. The principal reason that the EU is never going to be the United States of Europe is nationalism. The reason all those European empires in the 19th and early 20th century went down the toilet bowl is nationalism. I could go on and on.
And do you have a positive example of nationalism, saying like, well, thank God for nationalism, because if we didn't have it, we would not have had this good thing?
Well, you wouldn't have a United States of America if you didn't have nationalism, right?
That's good.
You
That's
wouldn't
good
have
for
a
you.
Serbia if you didn't have nationalism, right? Nationalism is a very powerful political ideology that's all about tribes, right? Groups, we call them nations, that want their own state. And it's here to stay. Is it all for the good? No. Does it have positive features and negative features? Yes.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you about the New Order. The New Order definitely begun, the new international order definitely begun in 1989 with an abrupt collapse of the Soviet empire, of the Soviet bloc. And that was a unipolar moment, definitely, with one pole of power emerging in the world, the United States. And you argue in your works that this is possibly the most powerful moment in any nation's history, power relative to other centers of power, the United States power at that time. But this order, most people would say, did come to an end. And some people believe it was in 2008 that in the 40 days from each other, Russia came back to history by doing something that people believed was never going to happen, which was made a military intervention outside the borders of the Russian Federation, followed by the Lehman Brothers collapse and the ensuing global crisis. But whether it was in 2008 or not, this is definitely no longer a purely unipolar world. So my question to you is, why was it so short? Why did the most powerful nation on earth relative to all others, possibly throughout history, why did it squander its hegemony and its unipolarity so quickly?
Well, when you talk about unipolarity, you're talking about the distribution of power in the international system. And you can have three distributions of power. You can have unipolarity, where you have only one great power. You can have bipolarity, where you have two great powers. And you can have multipolarity, where you have three or more. And I was born, and I imagine a number of people in this room from just looking around were born in a bipolar world during the Cold War, when you had the United States and the Soviet Union. And what happened is the Cold War ended in 1989, and the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And the United States, as Vuk said, was left as by far the most powerful state on the planet, and we entered the unipolar moment. Today, as of, I'd say, since roughly 2016, Most people, and certainly President Trump and his lieutenants, believe that we are now in a multipolar world. So we went from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. And the question is, what happened? Well, what happened is, first of all, you had the resurrection of Russian power under Vladimir Putin. Some of us in the room are old enough to remember what a total wreck Russia was in the 1990s. Putin comes to power at the end of that decade, and slowly but steadily over the course of the 2000s, Russia rises from the dead and becomes a great power. It's a weak great power, but nevertheless, it comes back from the dead. But the most important development, which the United States plays a key role in, and which really undermines unipolarity, is the rise of China. We're in a world today where there are three great powers: the United States, Russia, and China. And China is the real threat to the United States. And what's truly amazing, in my opinion, is that the United States played a key role in fostering Chinese growth in the 1990s and in the 2000s. We helped China grow into a behemoth. We helped China put an end to the unipolar moment. This was remarkably foolish. The key development in this process, by the way, was when we integrated China into the World Trade Organization in 2001, and thereafter, China took advantage of the WTO to grow and grow and grow. And of course, when you're in a unipolar moment, and the United States is much more powerful than China, and you help create a situation where China is growing and growing and growing, you're soon going to leave or exit from unipolarity and be in multipolarity. And this is exactly what happened. And we now live in a world where there are three great powers, as I said, and moving forward, the really interesting question is whether or not China is going to become as powerful as the United States, if not more powerful than the United States. You want to remember that China now has more than 4 times as many people as the United States. If it has a per capita GNI, gross national income, like South Korea, if it becomes a giant South Korea tomorrow, it will have approximately 2 times as much wealth as the United States. So we have helped create a state that would have tomorrow 4 times as many people as the United States and 2 times as much wealth if it was a giant South Korea. This is remarkably foolish. But the United States, which was captured by this foreign policy of liberal hegemony, thought that it could engage China and make China richer and richer, and we would live happily ever after. Any good student of Realpolitik knows this is crazy. The last thing you want to do is help another state on the planet grow more and more powerful, and indeed help it grow to the point where it may be more powerful than you. But the United States did it. And this is why I titled the book, The Great Delusion. This was one of our delusional policies.
So basically, to follow on just there, Bill Clinton was the first American president that was elected after the collapse of the bipolar order, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So if you were Bill Clinton's principal foreign policy advisor in 1992, he was very fresh in international politics, governor of Arkansas. Had he not surrounded himself with the likes of Tony Lake and others who led his foreign policy in the early years of the Clinton presidency, if you were the principal advisor of Bill Clinton, what would you suggest to Bill Clinton, the top 3 advice that you would give to President Clinton?
Well, the first thing is, apropos my previous set of comments, I would have told him not to go to great lengths to help China grow economically. This is a major mistake. Furthermore, I would have pushed very hard to convince him not to engage in social engineering. As you know, throughout most of the post-Cold War period, the United States was dedicated to spreading liberal democracy all over the planet. This was especially clear in the 2000s under George W. Bush, but it started with Bill Clinton. This was a major mistake. I also would have argued forcefully against NATO expansion. Bill Clinton is the president who set NATO expansion in motion. And in fact, the first major expansion took place in '99 when he was still president, when Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary became part of NATO. This was a huge mistake and is the principal cause of our trouble with Russia today. So I would have opposed that. And I also think that we went too far on globalization. We went from what I would call globalization to hyperglobalization. And I think the World Trade Organization is a manifestation of that policy. And I think that this has had negative consequences inside industrialized democracies like the United States. I think hyperglobalization and the economic consequences and the political consequences that flow from hyperglobalization have played a key role in putting Donald Trump in the White House.
And since you mentioned NATO and expansion of NATO, NATO is celebrating its 70th anniversary today in London. And just watching from the outside, it doesn't seem as a one big happy family. President Macron is calling it brain dead, and President Trump believes this is a nasty remark. However, he has a number of not so flattery remarks about some other allies and the alliance in general. What do you see as the future of NATO? Are you optimistic about the future of NATO? Like, where do you see NATO at the 80th anniversary?
There's no question that NATO's in serious trouble today. And I think it's principally because of Donald Trump. I think if Donald Trump had not been elected in 2016, there would be problems inside of NATO, problems for sure, but the problems would not be as acute as they are. The fact is that Trump thinks the Europeans, and here we're talking about the countries in NATO and the EU, have been taking advantage of the United States. Trump's basic worldview is we pay an enormous amount of money to provide security for Europe, and they don't pay their fair share. And not only that, they take advantage of us economically. This is his view. And this is why he's willing to slap tariffs on our West European allies as well. And he really has his gun sights on NATO and on the EU. He does not like those institutions. And this, I believe, is the principal cause of the trouble today.
But there could be another 4 years of Trump presidency.
Yes,
easily.
Right. That's why I think whether or not Trump gets reelected in 2020 is the key to understanding what the future looks like. If Trump is defeated in 2020, it's hard for me to see, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican, it's hard for me to see a new president being anywhere near as hostile to NATO as he is. He is sui generis on this issue. If Trump gets reelected, and he doesn't have to worry about re-election in 2024, I think he's going to be even tougher on NATO in his second 4 years than he was in his first 4 years. And then the question you have to ask yourself is what's going to be left standing when he's done? And you can make an argument that he can do fatal damage if he gets a second term. The counter to that is that there is so much support for NATO inside the United States, and there's actually so much support for NATO in Europe, despite what Macron said, that the institution will outlive Trump if he's given another 4 years. But I think there's no doubt that even if it outlives Trump, it'll be a wounded animal.
So we were debating a little bit. You mentioned Trump, whether he gets elected or not. But let's try let's try to abstract away who gets elected in 2020. There's a president in the White House in 2021, and it could be Donald Trump again, or 46th president of the United States. And I'm going back to the question that I asked you about Bill Clinton. So there is a president in the White House in January 2021. What are the top 3 things that you, John Mearsheimer, would advise the president of the United States when it comes to foreign policy?
Well, I think the first thing I would advise that the president do is concentrate on containing China. I believe that China is the single most important threat to the United States on the planet, and the United States should focus laser-like on China. Second thing I'd recommend that he do is fundamentally alter American relations with Russia. I think Trump's instincts with regard to improving relations with Russia are absolutely correct. I think if you're worried about China, as any American president will be and should be, you want to make sure that Russia is allied with the United States and that Russia is not allied with China. As a result of the Ukraine crisis, we have effectively driven the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. From a balance of power point of view, this is crazy. We don't want the Russians allied with the Chinese. We want the Russians on our side of the ledger. So I think that a new president should go to great lengths, not simply to focus on containing China, but to work with Russia to repair our relations with that country. Then I think the third thing I would do is fundamentally alter our relations with Iran. I think our policies are going to end up pushing Iran to get nuclear weapons. I think we're creating all sorts of incentives for them to get nuclear weapons. And I believe if Iran gets nuclear weapons, the Saudis, the Turks, the Egyptians, the Iraqis will all begin to think about getting their own nuclear weapons. I think what we're doing with Iran in terms of nuclear proliferation is very dangerous. The other thing we're doing with Iran is we're driving the Iranians into the arms of the Chinese. You understand that China now gets slightly more than 25% of its oil from the Persian Gulf. The Chinese are very interested in the Persian Gulf. The Chinese are building a blue water navy for the purposes of securing their sea lanes of communication into the Persian Gulf. The Chinese are going to be in the Persian Gulf in a big way. And what's happening here is that Iran and China are becoming very friendly. If you go to Iran today, I was in Iran in December of 2017, you see hardly any evidence of American influence. No McDonald's, no Starbucks, no nothing. You see lots of evidence of a Chinese presence. You do not, from a strategic point of view, from a balance of power point of view, want to drive the Iranians together with the Chinese. You want to keep them apart, and you want to be as friendly as you can with the Iranians. The same logic that I just laid out with regard to Russia, I believe applies to Iran. So my argument would be the president should concentrate on containing China, number one, 2, repair relations with Russia, and 3, repair relations with Iran.
Did you think that there can be an American president that be ready to take this advice? Not talking about the number 1, but number 2 and number 3. These number 2 and number 3, becoming friendly with Russia and fixing a relationship with Iran. It's very difficult to pull inside the Realpolitik of domestic politics of the United States, isn't it?
Yeah, I think at this point in time it's almost impossible. I think just with regard to Russia, there are a number of factors that explain American hostility towards Russia. I think some of it's just residue from the Cold War. I think some of it has to do with the fact that Putin stood up to the United States. When you stand up to the United States, that makes us very angry. And as a consequence, relations deteriorated, especially after the Ukraine crisis. Although it started, as you pointed out, Vuk, with the Georgia War in 2008. But the main reason I believe that U.S.-Russian relations are so terrible today is because Trump is associated in a positive way with Russia, right? And therefore, all of those people who loathe Trump, right, use the Russian issue to beat him over the head, right? So Russia, as an issue, has become bound up in really important ways with American domestic politics.
Yesterday, there was what's the name of a big host at Fox News who had a rant saying, like, why do we hate Vladimir Putin? What's wrong with Vladimir Putin? I can think of so many people from the Democratic Party who hate America more than Vladimir Putin. Like, do you think that this is movable? If, say, Trump wins another term in office and there is another Republican administration, possibly a Republican majority in the House, do you think it's possible to fix this relationship?
No.
No.
The only thing that'll fix the relationship is if China continues to rise and scares the Russians and scares the Americans and drives us together. It's like U.S. relations with the Soviet Union after the Russian Revolution in 1917. I don't know how many of you know this, but we, the United States, did not recognize the Soviet Union until 1933. Did not recognize the Soviet Union in 1933 because it was a communist country. And then we had terrible relations with the Soviet Union from 1933 until 1941. But what happened in 1941 is it looked like Hitler was on the verge of dominating Europe. And then on June 22nd, 1941, he invaded the Soviet Union. And we thought the Soviet Union was going to lose. And we thought that would be disastrous for the United States, which it would have been. And what we did is we flipped on the Soviet Union. And during the course of World War II, especially after we were attacked at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, and then Hitler declared war against us on December 11th, 1941, the Americans and the Soviets were pushed together. And we became very close allies during World War II. It was Uncle Joe who we were working with to defeat Nazi Germany. So there was a common threat that drove us together.
Yeah, but like, you think that, I mean, your argument is that the new Cold War between the United States and China is inevitable. You've been actually saying it for quite a number of years, unlike many. Now most of the analysts agree on this. But if there's like a virtual certainty that the US is going to end up in a Cold War with China, isn't there, by this logic that you're suggesting, a virtual certainty also that US and Russia are going to find a way of mending the fence?
Virtual certainty is too strong a word. A lot depends on how much how much China rises, how powerful it becomes, and how it threatens Russia. The Russians are very worried, for example, about Belt and Road and the implications of Belt and Road for Chinese influence in Central Asia, which is in their neighborhood. And if the Chinese grow really powerful, if they turn into a giant South Korea, and they begin to, develop a lot of power projection capability, and they have a lot of influence in Central Asia, and they begin to threaten Russian interests, then the Russians and the Americans will come together. But it's possible that China will not rise that steeply.
That's steep. But like, but your expectation is that it's much more likely than not that the U.S. and China are going to end in this Cold War 2.0-like confrontation.
There's no question in my mind, leaving the Russians aside, that if China continues to rise, the United States and China are going to be in an intense security competition, much like the Cold War. There's no question in my mind. And you already see that happening. The trade war, the technology war, the pivot to Asia, what's going on in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, Taiwan, there's real trouble coming. There's real trouble. all of you should read about the South China Sea. Just Google the South China Sea, U.S.-China competition in the South China Sea. It's very scary. I wouldn't be surprised if the United States and China ended up shooting at each other sometime over the next 2 or 3 years in the South China Sea. This is not to say we're going to have a major war, but the potential, for a military engagement is not to be underestimated.
So, and do you think that there's going to be this moment in the near future where there's going to be you're either with us or you're against this moment where countries will have to choose sides in this U.S.-China division?
Yeah, I think there's no question about that. I gave a talk in Australia in early August of this year, and the Australians have excellent economic relations with China, and they do not want to jeopardize those relations. At the same time, the Australians are getting very nervous about the threat from China, and they know they depend on the United States for their security. And what the Australians want is a situation where they don't have to choose between China on one hand and the United States on the other. And basically what I said to the Australians when I was there is that we're rapidly reaching the point where you're going to have to make a choice. Either you're with the United States or you're with China. And as I told the Australians, if you decide that you're going with China, you want to understand that the United States is going to be incredibly angry with you. The United States is going to put its gun sights on you, and it's going to make you pay a real price for siding with China against the United States. They're going to have to make a choice. And the Australians, of course, understand this. It disturbs them greatly, and I fully understand that. They'd prefer to stay on the fence and not have to make a decision one way or the other. But they're going to have to make a decision. And by the way, Europe is going to have to make a decision, because Europe is going to have to decide whether it trades with China and feeds the beast, and especially whether it trades dual-use technologies. Because the United States, once it really gets into a serious competition with China, is going to put great pressure on the Europeans. That's every country in Europe not to feed the beast. And the Europeans, of course, are going to have very powerful incentives to trade with China because it's important for their prosperity.
So this is very fascinating what you're saying. And if we really end up there where you will have no choice but to pick a side, and if you were to make a bet, if you would have to make a bet on the list of countries. I'm going to read you a list of countries one by one. So where do you think, U.S. camp or China camp, these countries are going to end if they will have no choice but to choose? India.
India is an open and shut case. India will be with the United States.
Pakistan?
Pakistan will probably ally itself with China. Pakistan and China have very close relations. The reason that Pakistan has nuclear weapons is largely because of China.
Indonesia?
Let me just say one more word about Pakistan.
Sure.
The United States will go to great lengths to peel Pakistan away from China and have Pakistan and India as an ally. The question you have to ask yourself is, can we do it? I think it's unlikely.
And how about Indonesia?
I think Indonesia goes with the United States.
And how about Germany?
Well, Germany doesn't matter that much in the sense it's not part of the balancing coalition. Okay?
Because my next question is France.
But France is the same. Europeans don't matter much for containing China because you have no military capability of any consequence. You don't spend much money on defense. You're not going to project military power into East Asia of any consequence. For purposes of containing China, you need countries like India, you need countries like Russia, you need countries like Japan, and then smaller countries like South Korea, Singapore, Vietnam. Those are the kind of countries, those are Asian countries. What you need from France and Germany, and this was my previous point, you need France and Germany not to trade dual-use technologies with China, not to feed the beast. But the Europeans don't matter for the military side of containment.
Yeah, but if the United States place Europe in this situation, guys, you got to stop feeding the beast, as you say. In other words, you can't trade practically anything with China because in 10 years from now, everything is going to be connected one way or another to the telecommunications network with the Internet of Things and 5G and all that. So basically, you can't trade with China. I mean, I don't mind about your military, you're hopeless in terms of the military capability, but I want you not to trade with China. First question, do you think that European Union is going to hold their act together and stay united in answering this question, or you think that there's going to be a division? And if you think that there's going to be a division, do you think France and Germany is going to answer in the end of the day this question in the same way?
Well, I just want to be clear. I don't think we can tell Europe that they can't trade at all with China. We're talking here about putting limits on trade. That's what we're talking about. And I understand your point that it looks like everything is now becoming a dual-use technology, and maybe this...
You can't buy a TV because TV has a 5G, and 5G is Huawei, and Huawei is on a blacklist.
Yes, but there will be a certain set of technologies that really matter, and we will go to great lengths to push the Europeans not to trade those technologies. But the more important issue, I think, is whether or not we can get the European Union, one, to act in unison, and two, to act the way we want them to. And I think it's going to be very hard to do both. I think if you look at what the French and the Germans are now doing, to use the two countries that you pointed to, Vuk, I think the French and Germans are not on the same page. The French have actually been quite upset with the Germans because they seem to be very interested in going to Beijing and trying to work out trade deals, whereas the French are more interested in sitting back and trying to come up with a common policy. So I'm not very optimistic. This is going to have consequences for Europe. And you want to understand that if I'm right, that the rise of China is going to be seen as a great threat to the United States, what we're going to do is we're going to concentrate on containing China. And that will have huge consequences for Europe. All of my adult life, right, Europe has been the most important area of the world for the United States. And East Asia was the second most important area of the world. We are now undergoing in the United States a fundamental transformation in our grand strategy. East Asia is now the most important area of the world. The Persian Gulf is the second most important area of the world. And the third most important area of the world, and it's a distant third, is Europe. Europe does not matter much to the United States anymore because there's no one especially powerful country in Europe. There's no more Soviet Union. There's no more Imperial or Nazi Germany. There's no equivalent of China in Europe. China is in Asia. This is why Hillary Clinton announced in 2011 the pivot to Asia, right? And when you pivot to some place, you're pivoting away from another place. And the place we're pivoting away from is Europe. And I say all that in the context of the question you just asked, because if you anger the United States on the trade issue, and when I say you, I mean Europe. If Europe angers the United States on the trade issue, that will give us an even more powerful incentive to pull all of our forces out of Europe, to put an end to NATO, and to concentrate laser-like on containing China. So this trade issue, right, this trade issue that's looming in the years ahead is going to have serious consequences for the American commitment to Europe.
So are you optimistic about Europe?
I'm not optimistic about anything at this point. We haven't even talked about American foreign policy. It's very hard to be optimistic about that.
But I'm not sure if there are too many places in the world where you would go and get a round of applause upon saying, I'm not optimistic about anything. This is a very Serbian thing. So I'm pleased that we gave you an opportunity to meet a part of our culture, for better or for worse. Let me shift, because I would like to give the opportunity to the audience as well to ask questions. But I'm going to ask you, and if you can answer in a relatively abbreviated way, in today's world, according to you, who are the top 3 states, top 3 capitals when it comes to pursuing smart foreign policy? Not necessarily a foreign policy with which you agree or which is good for the United States, but trying to be intellectually and analytically honest and impartial, the top 3 smartest foreign policies in the world today.
Yeah, I put China number 1. I think the Chinese have done a brilliant job at not fighting any wars and instead growing economically in a very smart and sophisticated way, taking advantage of their membership in the WTO to grow their economy in truly impressive ways. Second, I would point to Moscow, to Putin, Lavrov, as first-class strategists. I mean, the Russians are playing a weak hand for sure, but I think that Putin and Lavrov have done a truly excellent job playing that hand. And then third, I would probably say Japan. I think Japan has behaved in very smart ways. Of all our allies, I think the Japanese, of all America's allies, I think the Japanese have done the best job of dealing with Donald Trump, which is almost an impossible job. But the Japanese have done the best. And the Japanese have spent a sufficient amount of money on defense, but still managed to pass the buck to the United States in important ways so that we do most of the heavy lifting in East Asia and they don't. So I'd say that they're the third most impressive.
The three most impressive foreign policies. But this is also something that I ask most of our guests. Who do you think is the strongest leader in the world today?
Oh, there's no question, Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the president of the most powerful state on the planet. For many people, me included, that's what makes him so scary. He can do an enormous amount of damage. I mean, you described the unipolar moment before and just how powerful the United States was. And we agree that, you know, the United States is no longer as powerful as it once was. But even in this multipolar world of 3 countries, the United States is still by far the most powerful of those 3 countries. And Donald Trump runs the country. And whatever you think of his level of competence, the fact is that he is very powerful. And he has a tremendous amount of leeway. You know, we used to talk about checks and balances in the United States. There are very few checks and balances on the contemporary American presidency. And that means there are very few checks and balances on Donald Trump.
That sounds very interesting. Well, let me then ask you...
And depressing.
Well, thank you for sharing this sentiment with us. But let me slightly rephrase my question, and I wonder if I'm going to get a different answer. Who is the leader that you admire most in today's world? I'm talking about state leaders.
In terms of foreign policy?
Yeah, in terms of, well, no, I'll ask you about foreign policy, like the leader that you admire most in general, in terms of how he conducts his leadership in his country and internationally.
I don't know if I have a good answer to that question. I mean, as I said before, I think that Putin has done a truly excellent job on the foreign policy front. I don't know enough about what he's done at home to assess him there. I think Xi Jinping gets a lot of criticism because of his domestic political policies. but he also has done a good job on the foreign policy front.
Right.
So if you asked me, I'd say that probably Putin and Xi Jinping. If you ask me, if we go back to 1989 and we march forward, who I think the most impressive foreign policy maker was, I would say George H.W. Bush. I think he did a brilliant job ending the Cold War. He was a good realist. And I think the trouble started when Bill Clinton got elected and then continued when his son, George W. Bush, got elected and Barack Obama got elected. But George H.W. Bush is one of my heroes when it comes to foreign policy.
And who is, according to you, who is the most effective foreign minister in today's world?
Oh, I think that's easy. That's Sergei Lavrov, I think, is clearly the most effective foreign minister. He's been around for a long time, so he just has much experience. And furthermore, he's a very smart man.
So I'm going to now ask you probably a more difficult question in the same mold. Apart from John Mearsheimer, who is the most impressive scholar of international relations and foreign policy today in the world?
Aside from me, who is
I said aside from you.
I actually think there's a clear answer as I think of it. There is a clear answer. It's my co-author, the Harvard professor Steve Walt. And the reason I would say that he is the second most impressive is because he agrees with me on most issues.
I got to ask you one more thing. I was considering stopping here at a very high and positive note, but since you did mention Steve Walt, and by the way, Stephen Walt has kindly contributed an article for the next issue of our magazine Horizons, so we're very proud to feature Stephen Walt's article in our next issue, which is coming out in a couple of weeks from now. But you co-authored with Professor Walt a book that caused quite high controversy about the Israel lobby in the United States. So, and I know it's a big topic, but can you give us the gist of your argument, the one that you put forward together with Mr. Wald that made you one of the least popular analysts in the Jewish American community in particular?
Yeah, as I'm sure many of you know, in the American political context, interest groups wield enormous influence, much more so than in the liberal democracies in Europe. And we have groups like the National Rifle Association, the AFL-CIO, the Farm Lobby, the Cuba Lobby, that really matter greatly in the American political process. I think that the Israel lobby is the most powerful lobby in the United States. And it has a tremendous influence on American foreign policy, especially in the Middle East. Now, what exactly is the lobby? The lobby is a loose group of individuals and organizations that are deeply committed to pushing the United States in a pro-Israel direction. It is very important to understand that we do not refer to it as the Jewish lobby. We call it the Israel lobby. And the reason that we don't call it the Jewish lobby is because roughly 1/3 of American Jews don't care much about Israel at all. Very important to understand that. Another third care, but don't care greatly. And then there's about 1/3 that really cares. And that's the group, right, of American Jews that are linked, for the most part, with the lobby. Second point you want to remember is that we have these Christian evangelicals who are sometimes referred to as Christian Zionists, who are as fervent, if not more fervent, in their support of Israel than are the Jews in the lobby, right? So there are a substantial number of Jews in the lobby for sure, but not all Jews by any means, and there are a substantial number of non-Jews. And this is mainly the Christian Zionists. Christians United for Israel. This is John Hagee's operation, okay? And anyway, these groups operate in the American political system in completely legitimate ways. It's not like they're doing anything illegal or immoral. You can do this in the United States. And they are very effective. And what they have done is pushed U.S. policy, again, especially in the Middle East, in a pro-Israel direction. And Steve and I argue that this is not in America's interest. It does not make good strategic sense for the United States, not in our strategic interest, and from a moral point of view, it does not make good sense either. And furthermore, and this will be my final point, we make the argument that it's not good for Israel. And that the reason the Israelis are colonizing the West Bank and doing these horrible things to the Gazans is because the lobby provides cover. But ultimately, this is not in Israel's interest in our estimation. But pointing out that there is a powerful Israel lobby is not acceptable in the United States. Saying that that lobby is pushing us, the United States, to adopt a policy that's not in our interest is not acceptable in the United States either. So the end result is that we ran into a storm of criticism, and we fully expected that. We paid a serious price for writing, it was originally an article in the London Review of Books. We paid a serious price for writing the article and then writing the book.
Well, thank you very much for this. It was a fascinating route of questions. I have so many other questions to ask, but I really do want to give a chance to our audience to ask you questions. So, first question. You need to use the mic because we're recording the event.
First of all, allow me to say welcome to Belgrade, welcome to Serbia.
Thank you.
We've talked about China as a threat for the greater part of the evening, but if we look at the countries around the world, excluding the United States and China, if they look at these two countries, the United States and China, and look at America and say, this is a country that is or might be in the near future pressuring countries to choose between China and the United States. This is a country that is ready to slap sanctions on countries that don't do as the United States likes. This is a country that goes to war and bombs countries, and while the world was unipolar, has started several wars, bombing campaigns that were illegal in the eyes of the UN. And on the other hand, we have China, which hasn't started any wars, as you've pointed out, that has Belt and Road initiatives aiming to cooperate with countries around the world. If we look at all these other countries around the world, aside from the United States and China, who do they think is a bigger threat, the United States or China?
It's hard to say because it depends where you live and it depends what your past experience is with the United States and China. If you're Serbian, the answer is quite clear. The United States is the bigger threat. You remember what happened in the 1990s, especially in 1999. If you're Japan, you're South Korea, you're Vietnam, and you're living next door to this growing great power that has a big appetite, that says it owns the South China Sea, right? You don't view the United States as a bigger threat. You view China as a bigger threat. I've talked to a number of quite high-level Russians who believe that China is a greater threat to Russia than the United States, despite everything that's happened, because China is right next door. There are a number of other Russians who think that the United States is a greater threat because of NATO expansion, what's going on in Eastern Europe, especially with regard to Ukraine and Georgia and so forth and so on. So I find the Russians to be somewhat mixed on this. If you're Pakistan, getting back to the question that Vuk asked me, you probably are more fearful of the United States than you are of China. So it just depends. But I understand the basic point that you're making, which is that the United States has been something of a rogue state since 1989. As I like to point out, and I point this out in the book, the United States has fought 7 different wars since 1989. We have been at war for 2 out of every 3 years since 1989. The Afghanistan war is the longest war in American history. There's a study that I would encourage you all to look at that just came out from Brown University, right, on the consequences of American military policy around the world, but especially in the greater Middle East since 1989. The number of deaths that we're responsible for, the amount of money that we have spent fighting these wars, on the order of $6 trillion is truly remarkable. So it's easy to think that almost all states should fear the United States much more than China. But for better or for worse, it's just much more complicated than that. And a lot depends on geography, and a lot depends on what your particular experience has been with Uncle Sam.
Thank you. Gentleman there.
Thank you. Well, I have actually two short questions. My name is Slobodan Jankovic. I'm also from Belgrade, research fellow at the Institute of International Politics and Economics here in Belgrade. Well, the first question is, in your book, Why Leaders Lie, you define several types of lying in politics. And you said, among others, that you won't deal with the social imperialism. Well, could you say that with your article and afterwards with your book, and a book of Professor Walt also, that you dealt actually with this, also with this type of actions, with social imperialism, in the book Israel Lobby and the US Foreign Policy. And secondly, did you challenge with that book one of the central principles of realism, that it is the structure that defines the behavior of a unit? Thank you.
Yeah. I'll take the questions in reverse order. Basically, his second question is saying, doesn't your book on the Israel lobby contradict your theory of realism? John's theory of realism says that states do what's in their national interest, and that interest groups cannot or should not cause them to behave in strategically foolish ways. But yet you've told us this story in the Israel lobby, and in my answer to Vuk's last question, what I said was that the lobby has pushed the United States to behave in non-strategic ways, ways that are not in our national interest. And doesn't that contradict what I say in Tragedy of Great Politics? And the answer is yes, you're correct. There's a contradiction there. And my response to you on this whole issue is that any theory of international politics, which describes how states behave, is not going to get it right every time. Almost all scholars agree on that. A theory is a simplification of reality. And because it's a simplification of reality, and the world is very complex, sometimes there are going to be cases that contradict your theory. And as you correctly pointed out, the story that Steve tells and I tell in the Israel lobby contradicts my theory of realism and contradicts Steve's theory of realism as well. And we would both say this case is an anomaly. It's an unusual case. With regard to your first question about social imperialism, I'm embarrassed to say that I don't remember what I said about social imperialism in the book, Why Leaders Lie.
Because of interest groups. You did not want to deal with the lies that are being promoted by the interest groups in the government.
Okay. Okay. Well, the fact is that I think that, you know, interest groups, when they push states to do things that are not in their interests, are going to give those states incentives to come up with deceptive arguments about what they're doing. So I think that is true.
Yeah, I didn't mention one of the big books of Professor Mearsheimer was the 2011 Why Leaders Lie, but the 2019 version could be probably much richer, and perhaps even your visit to Serbia could have helped you write another volume of it. But we discussed only foreign policy. We said, like, we're not going to get into anything domestic. So, but there is a gentleman in the back who raised his hand.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mearsheimer, it's a great pleasure not just to hear what you have to say, but to hear how you have to say it. The art of the irony is a little bit forgotten in events of this kind. My two questions, if I may. The first one is when you were answering Mr. Jeremic's question on the, you know, which country will side with China, which country will side with the United States. You described as irrelevant the countries like the European countries which have no military might. And you said that the really relevant ones are the ones which have military clout. Does that mean that you see the containment of China?
Let me be very clear. Just on our policy towards China, right? It has a military dimension and an economic dimension. The military dimension is military containment, like during the Cold War, and the economic dimension is the trade war and the technology war. And what I was saying is that in East Asia and around the perimeter of China, you will have a handful of countries that will be involved in military containment and economic containment. My argument about the Europeans is they can't help us in any meaningful way with military containment. That will be where the economic containment comes in. Now, your question was, does that mean that I see serious potential for a shooting war? Because I'm talking about military containment. And the answer is yes. I think there is a real possibility. I'm not saying it's likely, but I think there is a real possibility that the United States and China will end up in a war over the South China Sea, over Taiwan, over the East China Sea, or maybe someplace else that I don't see at the moment. But the potential is great here. And I don't have time to go into this, but I think the potential for war between the United States and China is more likely than it was for the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War.
Thank you very much. The second question, not a word was said about Serbia and Serbian foreign policy. If you were to be the advisor of the current Serbian leadership, not that it would heed any advice from anybody, but if you were to offer any advice to a small country, an irrelevant country, which on the other hand thinks that it lies in the center of all global interests and it's hugely important, what advice would you give us?
I never feel terribly comfortable going to another country and telling people what I think their government should do. I would make one general point about small countries, and that is that I think that for small countries, and this is especially true for small countries that live next door or very close to a great power, your principal goal should be not to make that great power angry. And my favorite example in this regard is Ukraine. Ukraine is a country that is of great strategic importance to Russia. Therefore, Ukrainians have to be very careful not to anger Russia. It's just like any country in the Western Hemisphere. Think Cuba here, think Fidel Castro. Has to go to great lengths not to anger the United States. Because if you do, you will pay an awful price. Many Ukrainians believe that they live in a sovereign state that has the right to determine its own foreign policy. This is not the way you want to think if you're a Ukrainian. The Russians do not believe you have a right to determine any foreign policy you want. Just like we did not believe that Fidel Castro had the right to invite the Russians into the Western Hemisphere, right? So it's very important to understand, if you're a small country, that you don't want to anger a great power. Now, the great advantage that Serbia has is you don't live close to any great powers. Russia's far away, the United States is far away, and this is not the 1990s, where the United States was basically free to intervene in the Balkans in all sorts of ways. The last thing the United States wants to do at this point in time is get involved in the Balkans. And this is good news for you, obviously, right? And the Russians have come back from the dead. In the 1990s, you couldn't get much help from the Russians because they were basically in deep, deep trouble, but they've come back from the dead. So I think, you know, with regard to a small country operating in a system that's dominated, and the system is dominated by the great powers, I think Serbia is in pretty good shape. And I would just say that any Serbian government should go to great lengths not to pick a fight with a great power, because it usually doesn't end well.
Sir, there in the middle, you, yeah.
Thank you. And certainly they've made many. But when you say that Russians, and you said a lot of good things about the Russian, not foreign policy, but foreign policy skills. Let's make the difference. So, but we could say maybe that Russians are making certain mistakes as well. For example, in Ukraine, they've taken parts of the country, but they've, well, practically lost the rest of the country to the West. Also Chinese who are expanding in the South China Sea and have the situation in Hong Kong. So do you see certain mistakes in Russian and Chinese foreign policy, or potential mistakes that could in future cause them some level of influence in their foreign policy?
Well, I'll take the two examples in the order you laid them out. With regard to the Russians and Ukraine, Russia's basic goal with regard to both Georgia and Ukraine is to make sure they don't become Western bulwarks on Russia's border. They don't want Ukraine to focus on Ukraine. They don't want Ukraine to become part of NATO. They don't want it to be integrated into the European Union and become part of the West. And what the Russians are basically doing, in my opinion, is they're trying to wreck Ukraine to make sure Ukraine doesn't enter NATO. And the more the United States pushes to bring Ukraine into NATO, the more we push to arm the Ukrainians, the more we talk about making Ukraine a bulwark on Russia's border, the more the Russians will do to prevent that from happening, which means causing more trouble in Ukraine. And this is not in Ukraine's interest. But I think that given Russian objectives here, they've played their hand quite well in Ukraine, especially with regard to Crimea. I can understand why people are not happy in the West with the fact that the Russians took Crimea. But from a strategic point of view, it made eminently good sense to take Crimea. And it makes eminently good sense from a Russian strategic point of view to cause trouble in Ukraine, just as it made sense to cause trouble in Georgia, to prevent Georgia and to prevent Ukraine from becoming part of the West. I want to be clear here. I've written on this, as many of you know, in an article in Foreign Affairs where I made it clear that I think that it's the West, mainly the United States, that is principally responsible for the Ukraine crisis. The idea that you could drive NATO, which was a mortal foe of the Soviet Union, right up to Russia's borders, and this was going to have no consequences, is delusional, right? We should have known better. We created this mess. We have led, in my opinion, the Ukrainians down the primrose path. And we continue to lead the Ukrainians down the primrose path, right? But I think the Russians have played their hands quite well. This is not to deny for one second that the Russians haven't behaved, or to say that the Russians haven't behaved in ruthless ways with regard to Ukraine. They have behaved in ruthless ways. But this gets to my answer to the earlier question. This is the way great powers behave, including the United States. You do not want to cross a great power, because great powers behave ruthlessly. And this includes the United States, as this gentleman pointed out in his opening question. Now, with regard to China, you can make an argument that Xi Jinping has overplayed his hand by building islands, those small islands in the South China Sea. And some people argue that he's overplayed his hand in Hong Kong. I don't think that is really the case. I think that he's behaved in relatively prudent ways. This is not to say he hasn't made some mistakes. I think the Chinese have made a number of mistakes. I think that declaring himself leader for life and then changing the political rules so that he could get reelected was not a smart thing to do. But I think overall he's done a quite good job playing his hand. And I think the Americans have not done a good job, apropos the gentleman's opening question. I think the United States foreign policy, American foreign policy since 1989 has been characterized more by failure than by success.
Answering, I mean, I know you asked Professor Mearsheimer, but when it comes to Russia's mistakes, Montenegro comes to mind. But that's just me, perhaps. We don't have time for too many other questions, so in order to strike some kind of a gender balance there in the audience, please.
Good evening. Thank you for the gender equality moment. Professor Mearsheimer, it's been an absolute pleasure. I actually have a question regarding a country that you've briefly mentioned a couple of times, and that is Japan. We've seen the example of Senkaku Daioh Islands used constantly in this discussion. And what is, I perceive not commonly known, is that Japan is doing a very similar thing. They're extending their EEZ across the East China Sea and also the Pacific, therefore exacerbating their relations with China and actually fueling the conflict further. Considering their history and the fact that Abe has been beefing his military capacities over the last 5 years, in the possibility that it is Japan that triggers a conflict with China, how could you anticipate the US reacting in this way, considering with Trump being in power and potentially getting reelected? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. One of the problems in international relations is that steps or measures that one state takes to defend itself appear to the other side to be threatening or offensive in nature. As I'm sure some of you know, this is the security dilemma. In other words, when Hillary Clinton announces the pivot to Asia, Hillary Clinton says this is for defensive purposes. It's not designed to threaten China. But from China's point of view, it looks very offensive in nature. If China decides it's going to significantly increase its defense budget because of the pivot to Asia, China views this as a defensive move, but the United States and its East Asian allies view it as an offensive move. Right? This is the basic security dilemma. Anything you do for defensive purposes appears offensive to the other side. So that the problem that both the Japanese and the Chinese face is that anything they do to increase their defense capabilities or make it clear that they think islands belong to them, not the other side, is going to be seen as provocative by the other side. So what we have happening here in East Asia is that Japan and China are slowly but steadily building up their armaments, right, and extending their zones of influence and making increasingly provocative statements, at least provocative to the other side, about what territory they think is theirs. And the end result is that this fuels the security competition between Japan and China. And of course, the same logic applies to the United States and China. And we went through this in the Cold War. Anything the Soviets did to increase the Warsaw Pact's capability, we saw as offensive in nature. And anything we did to increase NATO's capabilities, they saw as offensive in nature, and we thought it was defensive in nature. And this is really getting at the essence of the tragedy of great power politics. Right? This is what makes security competitions between great powers happen all the time, and it's what makes them so tragic. So I think there's much truth in what you say, that the Japanese are doing certain things that are provoking the Chinese. You're correct. But the Japanese view those things as defensive in nature. And the things that the Chinese are doing, if you talk to the Chinese about what they're doing in terms of their defense budget and their foreign policies, they believe it's purely defensive. We're the ones who are behaving offensively. That's their view. But again, because of the security dilemma, both sides see things very differently.
I'm going to allow one last question. Sir, there. Sorry.
Professor Mearsheimer, thank you for an interesting lecture. My question deals with an argument you have made in your most important book, Tragedy of the Great Power Politics, when you said that global hegemony is a bad strategy because it is not feasible due to the stopping power of water. For example, Washington should not pursue, in your words, global hegemony as a strategy because there are Atlantic and Pacific Oceans that prevent this. But don't you think that this is not quite true when it comes to Atlantic Ocean now? Because the United States, during the post-Cold War period, managed to gain a very strong foothold on European continent by expanding NATO to the east. They are now, United States is now actually a land power in Europe, which is, when we look at the eastern border of NATO, better positioned for offensive against Russia than Hitler's Germany was in 1941. So if we start from this fact, don't you think that this offensive hegemonic policy of United States against Russia aiming to achieve a total European hegemony is actually a rational policy?
Let me just ask you a question. Why do you say that the United States today in Eastern Europe is better positioned to dominate Russia than Hitler was in June 1940?
Well, because of the eastern border of NATO, which is now more to the east than Hitler's troops were in 1941.
Yes, but Hitler had this huge army. He had the Wehrmacht, right, which was one of the most powerful armies in modern history. And because of what happened between September 1st, 1939 and June 22nd, 1941, the Soviet Union and Germany shared a common border. So this huge military machine called the Wehrmacht was right up against the Soviet border. And on June 22nd, 1941, they went shooting across the border. Second, there were no nuclear weapons at the time. If you look at the United States today, we have hardly any military capability in Eastern Europe. We don't look anything like the Wehrmacht. The idea that we, the United States, could invade Russia and conquer it the way Hitler tried to invade and conquer Russia is just unthinkable. And furthermore, they have thousands of nuclear warheads. We'd be insane to try and conquer that country. What we have here is, this gets back to one of Vuk's questions. We're now in a multipolar world. There's Russia and there's China. You can't be a global hegemon in a world where there's Russia and China.
Yeah, I understand. So it is not only stopping power of water, but nuclear weapons, furthermore, the fact that Eastern European countries don't have so much.
Yes, you're exactly right. But also, don't underestimate the stopping power of water, because the United States is across the Atlantic Ocean. So we do have to project power across the Atlantic Ocean, in your scenario, up to the Russian border, right? Again, the Germans were right there. And by the way, if you think about the United States dealing with China, the distance from San Francisco to China is 6,000 miles. So not only have we created, you know, this really powerful country that threatens to turn into a behemoth, right? We have to deal with that behemoth 6,000 miles away from the United States. That's the stopping power of water.
Thank you.
I don't think if all the Chinese scholars would have agreed that it was you who created China's giant today, they would argue that it had to do with the China itself.
Oh yeah,
as well.
I agree with that completely. Yeah.
But
we fed the beast.
Yeah. Well, let's end on this. Let's end on this note. Let me ask you to thank Professor Mearsheimer for spending this spectacular evening with us. Thank you very much. Now I ask you all to join us at the New Year's cocktail party here of the CIRSD, and Happy New Year and see you next year.